She was 18 years old, with $11 sewn into her hem and a heart that had stopped expecting kindness from anyone wearing her father's name. Eli Vance had stood on the porch of the only home she had ever known and told her, in a voice flattened by neither anger nor regret, that a man could not be expected to feed another man's mistake forever. And with that single sentence, he closed the door on Hazel Pruitt, who was not his mistake at all, but the daughter of his late wife's first marriage, a girl he had tolerated for 11 years and decided, the spring her stepmother died, he no longer had to. She had $25 to her name by the time she walked into the town of Amity Flats, Kansas, in the autumn of 1887. Money earned hauling water and mending nets for a fishing camp 2 counties over, money she had guarded the way other people guarded scripture. With it, she did not buy a room or a ticket east, or even a warm coat against the coming wind. She bought a barn. A leaning, forgotten, rat-haunted barn on the edge of a dead homestead nobody in Amity Flats would claim, sold to her by a tired clerk who took her $25 with the distracted pity of a man selling off a corpse's effects. It was a foolish thing to do by any measure that mattered to a girl with nothing. But what hung in the rafters of that barn, wrapped, waiting, deliberately hidden by hands that had known exactly what they were protecting, would not only change the shape of Hazel Pruitt's whole life. It would put right a wrong that the town of Amity Flats had been quietly bleeding from for 14 years, without ever understanding why. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Hazel Pruitt. If you are watching this from somewhere that the world has written off as finished, as used up, as not worth the trouble, tell us in the comments because this story was written for you. Hazel had not always been unwanted. Before her mother married Eli Vance, before the Vance Ranch and its silence, she had spent her first 7 years in a small cabin outside of Dover Crossing, where her real father, a quiet, broad-handed Welshman named Thomas Pruitt, had worked as a joiner, a man who built things meant to outlast the men who built them. He died of a fever when Hazel was 7, but in those 7 years he had given her something no one could repossess, an eye for wood and a reverence for the work of human hands. She remembered sitting on the dirt floor of his shop, watching him run his palm along an unfinished chest the way another man might touch a sleeping child, and she remembered him telling her, more than once, that wood remembers everything that is done to it, every kindness of the plane, every violence of the axe, and that a person with patience enough could read a piece of furniture the way a preacher read scripture, if they only knew to look. Her mother remarried 2 years after Tomas died, not for love but for survival, and Eli Vance took in the widow and her daughter the way a man takes in livestock he has not yet decided whether to keep. For 9 years, Hazel learned to make herself small and useful. She learned the names of every tool in the Vance toolshed because Eli would not buy a new one if she ruined an old one through ignorance. She learned to can preserves, to butcher a hog without flinching, to read brand marks at a glance, and to mend a harness in the dark by feel alone, because the lamp oil was rationed and her stepfather did not believe in wasting it on a girl's evening chores. She learned, too, the particular ache of being tolerated rather than loved, of eating at a table where her presence was accounted for like a debt rather than welcomed like a blessing. Her mother, Ruth, had been her only shelter against that coldness, a woman who would slip Hazel an extra biscuit or hum old Welsh hymns while braiding her hair, small mutinies against a husband who did not approve of softness. When Ruth died of consumption in the spring of 1887, 3 weeks after Hazel's 18th birthday, the last reason Eli Vance had ever had for keeping her died with her. He did not beat her or curse her, which she would later understand was somehow worse, because it meant he had thought about it calmly, the way a man calculates the cost of feed against the value of a horse, and concluded the arithmetic did not favor her. He gave her 2 days to pack and a name of a fishing camp where a girl might find honest work, and that was the whole of his mercy. What he did not give her, what he had never given her in 11 years, was any acknowledgement that her father had once been a man of real skill, a craftsman whose name, before the Vances ever arrived in that country, had meant something to people who needed good work done honestly. Hazel left the Vance ranch with a carpet bag, her father's worn folding rule, which Eli had never thought valuable enough to take from her, and a private, stubborn certainty that she would not spend her life being someone's tolerated burden. The 2 months after Ruth's death and Hazel's eviction were the leanest of her life, and she would speak of them rarely afterward, and only ever in plain, unembellished sentences, the way people speak of whether they survived rather than conquered. She worked the fishing camp at Willow Bend through the worst of a Kansas summer, gutting fish until her hands cracked and bled in the lye water, sleeping in a canvas tent with 4 other displaced women who had each arrived carrying some version of the same story: a husband dead, a father remarried, a farm foreclosed, a girl with nowhere assigned to her in the world's accounting. She saved every dime she could, refusing the cheap whiskey and the cheaper company that some men offered as comfort, because she had decided, somewhere in the dark of that canvas tent, that she would not arrive at her next chapter owing anyone anything that could be held over her later. By September, the camp closed for the season, and Hazel found herself on a westbound wagon with 2 other women, riding as far as her fare would carry her, which turned out to be the town of Amity Flats, a name that struck her, when she first heard it called out by the driver, as either a cruel joke or an aspiration nobody had managed to honor. Amity Flats was a town that the railroad had promised and then, after a surveying dispute and a bridge collapse 11 miles east, had quietly abandoned, leaving behind a half-built depot, a scattering of hopeful storefronts, and a population that had shrunk by half in a decade. It was, in other words, a town that understood exactly what it felt like to be discarded, though it would take Hazel some time to recognize the kinship in that. She arrived with $14 left in her hem after the wagon fare, intending only to rest a night and decide where to go next, and it was the town clerk, a tired, kind-eyed man named Otis Granger, who first mentioned, almost as an aside while processing her overnight lodging fee, that the old Callaway place out past the dry creek was being sold off for taxes, barn and all, dirt cheap, to anyone fool enough to want it. Hazel asked, out of nothing more than habit and her father's old curiosity about structures, what kind of barn it was. Otis told her it was a fine old barn once, built by a craftsman, though nobody now living remembered which one, and that the house had burned years back but the barn still stood, empty and unclaimed, because the Callaway family had vanished overnight back in '73 and never been heard from since, and nobody in town much wanted to disturb whatever had made them run. That single word, vanished, caught somewhere behind Hazel's ribs and would not let go. She went to see the barn the next morning before she had fully decided to buy it, walking the 1.5 miles out past the dry creek bed with Otis's directions and her father's folding rule tucked into her bag out of some instinct she did not examine too closely. The Callaway barn stood alone on a scorched and overgrown quarter section, gray with age, listing slightly to the north the way old structures lean when the prevailing wind has spent decades arguing with them, but when Hazel laid her palm against its siding, she felt something her months of hardship had not entirely starved out of her: recognition. The joinery at the corners was mortise and tenon work, pegged rather than nailed, the kind of patient construction her father used to say only a man who respected his own labor would bother with on a barn nobody important would ever see. She walked its length, running her hand along the beams, and found near the loft ladder a small carved mark low on the post, not a brand but a maker's stamp, a circle with a stylized letter T inside it, the kind of signature a craftsman left when he was proud of something most people would never look closely enough to notice. She did not know, standing there, that the mark belonged to her own father, dead 11 years and buried 200 miles east, but she felt the strange gravity of it anyway, the way a person sometimes feels the shape of an answer before they have the question. She walked back to town, found Otis Granger, and before sensible caution could talk her out of it, she handed over 25 of her remaining dollars, every cent but what she'd need for flour and coffee through the winter, and became the legal, foolish, penniless owner of a forgotten barn on a dead man's land. Otis warned her, not unkindly, that she was buying a haunted reputation along with the lumber, since half the town still whispered that the Callaways hadn't run from debt at all, but from something they'd seen or done or hidden. Hazel told him she did not believe in ghosts. She did not yet know that what she should have asked about was not ghosts, but rafters. She moved into the barn itself that first week, since it was dry and sound and free, stringing a curtain across one corner for privacy and setting up a cot beneath the loft, and she spent her days doing what little paying work Amity Flats could offer a stranger: mending harness, splitting kindling, helping the widow Aldridge with her wash, while her evenings she spent, almost helplessly, studying the structure around her the way her father had taught her to study any piece of wood, by touch. And by patience. It was on her 9th night, while sweeping loose hay and old grain dust from the loft floor in lamplight, that her broom caught on a length of oiled canvas wedged tight between 2 rafters near the roof's peak, bound with tarred rope in a knot that had clearly been tied to last, not merely to hold. It took her the better part of an hour, balanced on a ladder with her heart going harder than the work should have warranted, to work the bundle free without tearing it, and when it finally dropped into her arms, it was heavier than its size suggested, and it smelled, even after 14 years, faintly of cedar oil and old paper. She did not open it that night. She sat with it in her lap until dawn, some instinct telling her that whatever the Callaways had hidden so carefully, so high, so deliberately out of the reach of casual hands, deserved to be opened in daylight, by someone steady enough to receive it properly. When morning came, she untied the rope with fingers that had gone slow and careful and unwrapped, layer by layer, what turned out to be 2 things bound together: a beautifully made cherrywood writing box, dovetailed with the same patient, prideful joinery as the barn itself, and beneath it, wrapped separately in oilcloth, a ledger book, its leather cover swollen with damp but its pages, miraculously, still legible. The ledger belonged to a man named Josiah Calloway, and as Hazel read by lamplight over the following days, piecing together entries written in a careful, anxious hand across the years 1869 through 1873, she understood that she was holding the private record of a man who had discovered something he did not know how to survive knowing. Amity Flats, in its founding years, had been platted and financed in large part through a county land trust. Money pooled from nearly every homesteading family in the region to fund the railroad spur that was meant to save the town. The same spur whose failure years later had hollowed Amity Flats into the half-empty place Hazel now called home. Josiah Calloway had been the trust's appointed treasurer, a position of trust in the truest sense, and his ledger recorded, in increasingly tormented entries, his discovery that a younger man named Bennett Cole, then a rising land agent and now, Hazel would soon learn with a cold drop in her stomach, the richest and most respected man in Amity Flats, had been quietly siphoning trust funds for years, falsifying surveys, paying off a rival assessor, and ultimately engineering the very bridge collapse that doomed the railroad spur so that he could buy up the panicked, devalued homestead claims of his neighbors for pennies once the town's hope collapsed. Calloway had confronted Cole, the ledger suggested, and been threatened. Not with violence exactly, the entries were careful never to say so outright, but with ruin, with the kind of slow, total destruction a powerful man can visit on a poor one through debt and rumor and the law's own crooked leniency toward money. Calloway, frightened for his family and unable to prove his claims without evidence Cole had taken pains to bury, had instead hidden away what proof he did have, receipts, a partial confession Cole had been foolish enough to put in writing during an early arrogant negotiation, and the ledger itself. And then he had simply vanished with his family in the night, choosing flight and silence over a fight he did not believe he could win. The writing box, Hazel realized as she examined its construction more closely, bore the same maker's mark she'd found on the barn post, the circle with the letter T, and she finally understood, with a feeling like cold water down her spine, that the box had been built by her own father years before his death, likely as ordinary commissioned work for a man he'd never have suspected would one day use it to hide the truth about a town's slow ruin. Her father's hands, completely unknowing, had built the vessel that would one day deliver justice he never lived to see. Hazel did not rush to act on what she'd found because she understood, with the same patient clarity her father had taught her about wood, that proof handled carelessly could be destroyed as easily as it could be revealed, and that Bennett Cole, now a county commissioner, a deacon at the Amity Flats Church, a man whose name was on the new schoolhouse and the feed store both, had spent 14 years becoming exactly the kind of man whose word would be believed over a friendless girl's. She spent 2 careful weeks confirming what she could against public record at the county seat, comparing handwriting samples from old land filings to the confession in the ledger, and quietly asking Otis Granger, whom she had come to trust, about the old bridge collapse and the original trust without ever revealing what she'd found, learning that Otis himself had lost his father's homestead claim in the very buyout Cole had orchestrated, and that the wound of it, 14 years old, still sat in him like a splinter gone septic. When Hazel finally did go to Cole directly, not yet to accuse him but to test the water, mentioning casually that she'd found some old papers belonging to the Callaways in her new barn, his reaction told her everything the ledger had only suggested. He went the color of old ash, then recovered himself with the smooth, practiced charm of a man who had talked his way out of worse, offering to take those old papers off her hands, for a sum that would have solved every material problem she had, framing it as charity toward a poor young woman burdened with worthless trash. When Hazel demurred, saying she thought she'd keep them as a curiosity, Cole's charm thinned at the edges, and within the week, the consequences of having refused him began to arrive with the calm, deniable efficiency of a man who knew exactly how to ruin someone without ever raising his voice. Her small jobs around town dried up one by one. A rumor began circulating that the Calloway barn was cursed and that the strange Vance girl living in it was not quite right in the head. And finally, Cole's lawyer filed a quiet challenge to the validity of her tax sale, claiming an irregularity in the county's paperwork that would, if upheld, return the Calloway land and everything on it, including, unspoken but understood, the barn's rafters, to the county, meaning to Cole's allies on the board, meaning effectively to Cole himself. It was Otis Granger, of all people, who helped Hazel see the shape of her own defense, telling her one evening, with the weary honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose by speaking plainly, that a confession and a ledger were no good locked in a barn or even in a lawyer's drawer, because Cole had spent 14 years making sure that powerful men believed him and not whatever inconvenient paper might surface against him. What she needed instead was the one thing Cole could not buy off for. quietly suppress, which was the open public memory of the very people he had ruined. So Hazel did something that took more courage than she had needed for any single act of her hard life so far. She called a town meeting in the half-finished depot building that stood as the town's only monument to its own betrayal, and she did not begin by accusing Bennett Cole of anything. She began by reading, aloud in her clear and steady voice, her father's old habit of patient explanation alive in every measured sentence. The entries of Josiah Calloway's ledger exactly as he had written them, dates and names and amounts, laying the whole quiet tragedy of the town's founding out before the very people who had lived inside its consequences without ever understanding their cause. She read Otis Granger's father's name among the ruined homesteaders. She read the names of 3 other families still living in Amity Flats who had lost claims in the very buyout the ledger exposed. She showed them Cole's own handwriting, the partial confession he had once been arrogant enough to commit to paper, and let the room's collective rising fury do the work that no accusation from her alone could have accomplished. Bennett Cole, present in the room because his own pride would not let him stay away, tried first to dismiss the ledger as a dead man's bitter fiction, then to threaten legal action against Hazel for slander, but the room had already turned, the way a held breath finally releases. And Otis Granger stood and said in a voice that shook only slightly, that he would swear before any judge in the state to the timeline of his own father's ruin, and one by one the other named families stood with him, until Bennett Cole stood alone in a room full of the people he had quietly broken. What followed was not the swift, dramatic punishment of a dime novel, but something Hazel came to feel was more honest and more lasting. The county board, suddenly very interested in distancing itself from a commissioner under open public accusation, launched a formal inquiry, and within the month Cole resigned his position rather than face it, his name quietly stripped from the schoolhouse cornerstone the following spring. The legal challenge to Hazel's tax sale evaporated the instant Cole's allies on the board realized which way the town's anger now pointed, and her ownership of the barn and its land was confirmed clean and clear, and most importantly to Hazel, the surviving documentation in the ledger, particularly Calloway's careful accounting of trust funds improperly diverted, gave the county sufficient grounds to reopen the question of the original railroad trust, resulting eventually in a modest but real settlement that returned partial value to the families who had lost their original claims, Otis Granger's among them. Hazel herself wanted no money from any of it, a fact that surprised the town nearly as much as the revelation itself had, and when asked by a newspaperman from the county seat what she intended to do with the barn now that its secret was out, she said only that she intended to do what it had always been built for. She reopened it as a proper carpentry shop, the first in Amity Flats since the town's slow decline began, teaching herself further from her father's old folding rule and from the patient logic the barn's own joinery had taught her, and within 2 years she had trained 3 apprentices, 2 of them daughters of the very families Cole had ruined, girls who had grown up believing, as Hazel once had, that their family's poverty was simply a fact of the world rather than a wound someone had inflicted on purpose. So when we say that Hazel Pruitt was 18 years old, cast out by a man who measured her worth and found it wanting, and that she spent her last $25 on a barn nobody else would touch, we are not telling you a story about luck or about treasure, though there was a kind of treasure in those rafters. We are telling you about a girl who had been taught, by a father she barely had time to know, that the things people discard often hold more truth than the things they keep, and that patience applied honestly can pry open even 14 years of buried silence. The mark Hazel found on that barn post and on that writing box was not a coincidence the universe handed her. It was simply the slow, true logic of the world finally circling back to settle a debt of recognition it had owed her family all along, her father's careful, honest hands reaching forward across more than a decade to undo a wrong he never lived to see committed. Hazel never did reconcile with Eli Vance, who, true to his nature, neither apologized nor explained himself when word of her unlikely rise reached him. She simply let that silence be its own quiet justice, choosing instead to build a life and a livelihood and in time, a kind of chosen family among the apprentices and neighbors who had come to trust her name the way Amity Flats had once trusted her father's mark, without either of them ever meeting. The barn still stands today in our telling of it, no longer leaning, no longer forgotten, its rafters empty now of secrets but full instead of the quiet, ordinary business of people building things meant to outlast them, which, in the end, was the only inheritance Hazel Pruitt had ever really wanted. Thank you for spending this time with Hazel and with the town of Amity Flats and with us. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless. We'd love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? A barn or a person or a town nobody believed in anymore? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one and we treasure the stories you trust us with. Until next time, stay close.